Savior, my closest friend. I will worship you until the very end.
Thanks, Bill. You pray with me, please. Holy and loving God, for this evening we thank you for the time that we have together. And we ask that you come and that you touch our hearts, that you take my words and that you mould them into whatever it is that you want us to hear, and plant them deep within us so that we're connected even more strongly and deeply to you. And we ask this, Jesus, in your holy name. Amen. Amen. So it's been a while now, and they unfortunately still haven't had a chance to get the heating fixed. So it's a nice warm afternoon, and behind me is a furnace. So that's why we've kind of put these here to kind of, it is absolutely boiling hot. But so, sorry?
They might melt.
They might melt. Yeah, hopefully not. So we are into May, and we are into Mental Health Awareness Month. And I want to start off by adding to the little bit of blurb that's on the back of your bulletin, which is to say that when I'm talking about mental health issues, I can only talk from my own experience. And I'm sure that when Reverend Peter shares with us later in the month, we'll be talking from their experience as well. So it may be very different to your experience. And it may be that we have things, that we have some things wrong. In which case, please do come and tell us. Come and tell us if your experience is very different, because then we can learn. And come and tell us if your experience is the same, then we don't feel like we're on our own. So either which way, please, please do take time out to come and talk to us. But I suppose my first insight into mental health came when I was about 12 or 13 years old. And I remember I was driving with my father, and we'd driven past this house, and as we drove past, he wound down the window and he yelled out of the window, "Unclean, unclean." And I was mortified. I remember hunching down in my seat, and he said, "Oh, that woman there is nuts. She constantly cleans everything. She takes all the labels off the tins and scrubs them and puts them away." And it turned out that she was the mother of a friend of mine. And I found it very, very difficult, first of all because it was my first insight into mental illness. Before that I'd never really been aware of it. And secondly, it was the first time I'd realised that my father was a prat. And that kind of comes as a shock to a 12 or 13-year-old boy. But it also, of course, then turned out that my father had his own mental health issues, which, of course, took some time to come to terms with and to deal with. And over the years, we found out that Dad was bipolar, and over the years we found out that I was bipolar. So we had a lot in common, or at least you think we had a lot in common. And the last brush that I had was when he died. I don't know if you know, but my father took his own life, and there's a whole story with that around mental health. And at the funeral, there were 3 or 4 Jehovah's Witnesses sat on the back row. And my father had been in this local congregation for 40 years, had been an elder in the congregation for 40 years. And there must have been 150 in this congregation, but there was maybe 3 or 4 at the funeral, probably because of the way that he died. And I remember at the end of the funeral feeling suddenly this sense of rage, this sense of unfairness, this sense of absolute rage against what had happened. And I remember suddenly I lost all control, and I set off from the front of the chapel to the back of the chapel to give these people a piece of my mind, or tear them apart, or whatever. And as I walked to the back, in one of those rare moments where Jesus actually speaks to you, I could hear absolutely clearly Jesus say, lots of people live very happy lives as Jehovah's Witnesses, but your daddy was a very poorly man. And that was it. And of course it took the wind out of my sails, and by the time I got there I just kind of looked at them and said, thanks for coming, and just left. But I think one of the real challenges with mental health issues, with mental illness of any kind, is where do we find it in the Bible? Because I remember growing up and nowhere in the Bible was there any example of mental health issues. And even today, I hear some preachers talk about how Jesus cast out demons and that this was quite possibly mental health issues, maybe epilepsy or some other illness that Jesus was dealing with. But I don't know that, so I want to put that to one side. There's a really interesting article in the US Library of Medicine by Stephen Matthews and Jaraj Pandian, and I'm going to apologise if they ever read this because I think I've got their names wrong. But it's about illness in Bible characters. Because although the Bible doesn't specifically talk about mental illness, I think we see signs of it all over the place if we have the eyes to look. So, for example, Samson. Samson, and if you remember the story, Samson had unusual strength. But there are other clues that point to something really, really major going on for Samson. First of all, he has this extraordinary strength, but he believes that his strength lies in his hair. Secondly, he has this habit of eating unusual foods from unusual places. So one day he ostensibly kills a lion, and a few days later walks past and some bees have made a little hive in it and there's some honey in there, so he reaches into the lion and eats the honey from the dead lion. That's not a good thing to do, but it does point at the Samson's mentality. And then of course you have the story of Delilah, and 3 times Delilah tries to con Samson into telling her where his strength lies. And even by the end of it, Samson hasn't worked out, really, that she's a dangerous woman. He just hasn't seen this. And reading the story, you can see it from the get-go, that this woman is using Samson, and you know that right at the end. But Samson doesn't seem to be able to get a hold of that. Well, from my own experiences, that points to being somewhere on the autistic spectrum. Because I've got friends who are on the autistic spectrum, and there are issues that they deal with that are very, very similar. The not being aware of their own strength, of not being aware of the bigger picture. Right at the end, Samson, for example, pushes the columns out of the way, not only kills everyone in the amphitheatre, but kills himself in the process. It's, that kind of mentality I see in other people, and I do wonder whether that was the case for Samson. And then there's the story of Isaac. Now, I don't think that Isaac, from the story, was dealing with a mental illness per se. However, there are a couple of really interesting clues as to something that was going on with Isaac. First of all, wherever they go, they have to have lots of fresh water. So wherever they go, they dig a well, which is unusual, because normally what you would do is you would camp somewhere, and you would camp within sight of a well. But whenever Isaac went anywhere, they had to dig a well and make sure that there was fresh water available there. And then at the end of his life, he couldn't distinguish between his 2 sons. He couldn't distinguish between the 2 boys, between Esau and Jacob. And I do have to wonder whether he was diabetic, because if you're diabetic, then your need for water is quite extraordinary. And when glaucoma sets in, and this is 3,000 years ago, there were no cures for this. Then what happens is that your sight goes, and you have a macular degeneration. So I wonder if that was what was going on. Ezekiel. Now Ezekiel laid on his right side for 390 straight days. And then he flipped over for another 40 because he heard God tell him to do so. And he built little models of Jerusalem out of sand. And then he lay siege to a stone using a pot. That's Ezekiel 4. He even cooked his food with human waste. And he dug a hole in his own home and squeezed himself through it with all his possessions on his back. I think that points to mental illness. I think that Ezekiel was very, very deeply troubled. And then right at the end, it talks about Ezekiel being inside the home, unable to leave, tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth, being unable to talk properly, and being unable to move. And it really, the whole pattern looks like he suffered for years with schizophrenia and then had a major stroke. That's what the pattern looks like in terms of the medical scenario, and that's what Jaraj and Pandian are looking for. That's what they're seeing in this. Saul was manic depressive. Saul was definitely bipolar. On the one hand, Saul was either troubled by a dark, evil spirit that had him so depressed, all they could do was to play music to him in the hope of being able to kind of soften it for him. Or he was out at the front of his army, leading them to victory, because when he was manic, he was unstoppable. He was absolutely unstoppable. That's how he became king, because when he was out there, he was absolutely vibrant, and yet when he wasn't manic, then he was completely depressed. Well, that's bipolar. That's, I know this. I've seen this. And that certainly looks like what's going on. And then, of course, Moses had a speech impediment, so much so that Aaron had to speak on his behalf to Pharaoh. King Ahab, he suffered with terrible depression. He would lie in bed all day, facing the wall, refusing to eat. Is this a familiar scenario? Lying in bed all day, facing the wall, refusing to eat. That's a severe depressive episode. Nabal. Do you remember the story of Nabal? So Nabal's the guy who, when King David has got some men and they're coming through his territory, he sends a little message to Nabal saying, we're coming through, if you'd like to help us out, then we'd like somewhere to stay, we'd like some food, blah, blah, blah. And Nabal gets into this rage and sends this really insulting message back. Now, fortunately, the messenger was quickly followed by a second messenger from Abigail, Nabal's wife, because Abigail knew what Nabal was like, so she sent a message to King David saying, do you know what? My husband's not quite in his right mind. Please don't take any notice. Don't take offense. We'll have food for you. We'll have lodgings for you. Blah, 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 blah. And then Nabal finds out that Abigail has sent this message to King David, and he gets into such a rage that it looks to all intent and purpose like he has a heart attack, and it kills him. David, seeing the kind of woman that Abigail is, marries her, but that's another story. But I think that Nabal, again, had some severe mental issues, and Abigail was basically walking him through that. She was his carer, making sure that he didn't create havoc and mayhem and for the family. Look at the disease, stress, and ultimately the PTSD suffered by Job. He wrote, amid disquieting dreams in the night, when deep sleep falls on people, fear and trembling seize me and made all my bones shake. That's a panic attack. That is a panic attack. In the middle of the night, for no reason, suddenly fear and trembling and unable to stop shaking. That's a panic attack. In the Psalms, King David was often troubled and dealt with what he called deep despair. Psalm 102, he says, for my days vanish like smoke, my bones burn like glowing embers, my heart is blighted and withered like the grass. I forget to eat my food. In my distress I groan aloud and am reduced to skin and bones. I'm like a desert owl, like an owl among the ruins. I lie awake, I've become like a bird alone on the roof. He's the king. He's got all these wives and courtiers and children, and yet he feels completely alone. King Nebuchadnezzar, he was, bless him, he was driven out of his own palace because it says that he ate grass like an ox and would sleep in the open. In the morning he'd wake and there'd be dew all over him. It said that his nails grew like claws and that his hair was like feathers. Again, this is somebody who was just not taking care of themselves at all. This is somebody who suffered a complete mental breakdown. Today, we'd have some psychiatric help. In those days, he was pushed into a field in the hope that he'd get better. And then I think the most controversial example is the Apostle Paul. Now, of course, the Apostle Paul was a zealot. He went out persecuting Christians. And I have to wonder why he was a zealot in the first place. Because, I remember getting told that the reason he did this was because he was a Pharisee. Well, actually, that doesn't ring true. Because Pharisees, on the whole, weren't anti-Christian, oddly enough. In fact, we've got a story in Acts 5:34 where Gamaliel, if you remember, is talked to about Christians, and Gamaliel says, what I would do is leave them alone, because if they're not from God, then they're like any other sect and they'll disappear. And if they are from God, then you don't really be messing with something that God does. Now, Paul studied under Gamaliel, so I don't see why being a Pharisee would make him into a zealot. So was there something else, perhaps, in his character that drove him into persecuting people? Was it perhaps that his thorn in the flesh, as he called it in 2 Corinthians 12, was something that drove him? He had a physiological or psychological problem. Some people suggest that it might have been his eyes, that he had really bad eyesight. Galatians 6:11, he says, "Look with what large letters I write to you," to the congregation in Galatia. But personally I find that unlikely, because Paul wrote all these letters in Common Greek. And because he wrote in Common Greek, that meant that he was literate to quite a low standard. So when he wrote anything in higher Greek, he'd write it with quite large letters because it's quite complicated. So I don't think that necessarily points to a problem with his eyes. Maybe there was something else that caused a feeling of guilt. Religious zealots tend to fear being an outsider more than death. And this is a Jehovah's Witness. I think this is the main reason why my father came to the end that he did. The problem is, if you have this internal disqualification that puts you on the outside, then the worst thing that can possibly happen is for people to see that and physically put you on the outside. Maybe Paul was dealing with something like that. Maybe he was gay. Generally, in religion, I found that those who are the worst homophobes and bigots are usually people who end up being gay. They're usually the ones that end up having their photos taken with rent boys and outed. It's this kind of thing. So it's maybe Paul had an issue there. I don't know. So the truth is, I really don't know why Paul felt the need to persecute Christians. However, in terms of their danger to Judaism, it was reasonably understandable. The thing about Christians is that, and at that time they weren't called Christians, they were called followers of the way. But the thing about the followers of the way was that they said that you really didn't need to follow the law, and that you didn't need to sacrifice at the temple. So if you were somebody who had a strong relationship with the temple, which Paul did, and if you were somebody whose livelihood depended upon sacrifices in the temple, which as a tent maker Paul's did, then maybe that was enough. But again, don't know. But he has this conversion experience, which is what Tony read earlier. And during this conversion experience, he sees this blinding light and hears Jesus' voice. Some people point to that and think that perhaps that's some kind of psychotic break. Again, I don't think so, but certainly in medical terms, it can look like it. The thing about Paul is that if you read his Gospels, he can say one thing one place, and then he can completely contradict himself somewhere else. So maybe he was just in two minds about things. Maybe that pointed to some problem. Or maybe it's just that he grew in his faith over 10 or 12 years, and we see different snapshots of that. I think that's perfectly reasonable. Or we tend to forget that, of course, we only have one part of a letter. We have Paul's answer to a letter. So, for example, when he writes to the Corinthian congregation, he's writing in response to a letter that he received from them. So we don't know what questions he's answering. So, for example, in Corinth, maybe they had a situation where the congregation was still segregated, because early in his ministry, they modeled everything on the synagogue. Men were over here, women were over there. So maybe what was happening is that during the service, some of the women were talking about what was going on and what was happening, and perhaps they were chatting about what was going to happen for dinner, and maybe there was some talking going on, and maybe nobody could address it because their families were quite wealthy or influential, and maybe what Paul did to help them out was just put a complete blank on women shouldn't talk in the church. Now that doesn't mean that he was down on women. It does mean that he might have been trying to address a specific problem in a specific church, and quite badly, but that's not unusual for Paul. People actually accuse him of being mad in 2 Corinthians 5:13. He says, if we're out of our mind, as some say, then it's for God, and if we're in our right mind, then it's for you. So, obviously, people thought that there was something wrong with Paul. Now, maybe that was just because of the gospel message he preached. Maybe there was some other reason. Maybe there were some mental health issues at play. I really don't know. But when you look at Paul's life, you can certainly see patterns which are familiar. So, when we look at the Bible, and we look at the Bible characters, I think it's safe to say that many of them suffered from some kind of mental illness, some kind of trouble. And it's very easy to look at this and think that this is all God and not just chemistry. Because others then look at this and see the extraordinary power of God at work. And personally, I don't think that God causes mental illness. However, what I do know in my experience is that no matter where we are on our journey, health-wise, whether we have problems physically, whether we have problems emotionally, whether we have problems with our mental health, that doesn't stop God from using us. And what I choose to see in all of these stories is people who had very real problems, and yet God chose to use them and use their problems. One of the things he said to Paul was, my grace is enough for you. And Paul says that God's strength is made manifest in our weakness. So I choose to see in all of these cases God's extraordinary hand reaching through and reminding us that no matter where we are on our human journey, that God is with us and God can use us to do extraordinary things. I think it's we who tend to put ourselves out of the picture for whatever reason. It's never God that does it.